Welcome to Dr Joe Unplugged. This podcast contains general information and is not in any way medical advice. What is the issue that nobody wants to talk about? Interesting question. I got thinking about this after watching a brief video by Robert F. Kennedy Jr. And obviously he's the independent candidate running for the presidency of the United States. And in his video, he talks about the increase in chronic disease, obviously in the United States, but it's fair to say that that applies to all of the Western world over the course of his lifetime. And he goes on to say, look, when he was in school, there was a very small number of children had any ongoing chronic mental or physical health problems. Same with adults. And now today, there's a very large number of children and adults with chronic illness. And he makes the point, which I thought is so obvious, but I'd not thought about it either. Nobody is talking about that, not particularly in a political sense in the USA or in Australia or elsewhere. And again, it's not probably within the scope of this podcast to look into why that is, but perhaps we don't need to absolutely know why they're not talking about it to say, well, we can do something about it. And the key is the intake of ultra-processed foods. That has been the biggest change in the last 60 years. For those who can remember the 1960s, and yeah, I know the idea that if you can remember the 60s, you probably weren't there. People did tend to eat more along the lines of what human beings had eaten for thousands of years, which is foods that were basically fresh, so meat, fish, chicken, vegetables, fruits, nuts, seeds, berries. There was some, but not that much processed food, and it certainly wasn't a major part of our diets. From the 1970s and particularly the early 80s with the introduction of the low-fat dietary guidelines, that changed significantly. And this work from the Florida Atlantic University Schmidt College of Medicine has estimated that in the United States, 70% of children's and 60% of adult food intake is ultra-processed foods. Now, in Australia, it's probably not quite that much, but it'd be fairly close. And I suspect in the UK, it's probably fairly similar. My guess is that in European countries, probably not quite as bad, but, they'd also be doing their bit. Now, as it says here, not only is ultra-processed food lacking in the nutritional integrity of whole foods, but it's loaded with ingredients designed to make them more appealing to our taste buds and make us crave more. And this article, and we'll put this down below so you can click the link, as they say, there are emulsifiers such as carrageenan, mono and diglycerides, carboxymethylcellulose, polysorbate, soy lecithin. There's a whole lot of additives and preservatives. And typically when you look at the labels in ultra-processed foods, and look, maybe just call them processed foods. I mean, where does the line get drawn with ultra? I think that's a semantic point. But the more different ingredients there are in a food, so the longer the list on the label and the more that list has numbers instead of words. And the reason for that is because these words are so long that if they had them all spelled out, it'd probably go 3 times around the label. And it probably should tell you something. Michael Pollan, who is an American food author, really has some very, very good tips. And one of his was, don't buy foods where it's on the label ingredients that you don't recognise or that you might not be able to have in your pantry at home. So a classic example may be a cake. Now, if you make a cake at home, you'll have some flour, sugar, eggs, butter, maybe some baking soda, a couple of other ingredients. There won't be a long, long list. Maybe some chocolate if you're making a chocolate cake. If you buy a cake at the supermarket, that may have a very long list of ingredients, including, again, lists of numbers which are preservatives, additives, emulsifiers, and. Now, immediately people will say, well, surely these things are safe, otherwise they wouldn't be allowed to be sold. Yes, they're safe. They're not going to kill you. That's not the issue. That asks the wrong question. If you ask the question, are they poisonous? The answer is no. If you ask the question, are they safe? The answer is yes. If you ask the question, is it good for you? And that's what nobody asks, then the answer to that one is no. And once again, it's not that it has an immediate impact, or if you eat this type of food now and again, it's the end of the world. No, it isn't. Chronic disease implies just that. Evolution over years and maybe decades, certainly not days and weeks and months. And by putting more of the types of foods into your body that the body doesn't really need, two things happen. Number one, there's a substitution effect. So if we're putting in all these other components, it can replace more nutritious foods, so we're not getting as much vitamins and minerals. Number two, and because it doesn't provide the nutrition, the body is still hungry. And then turn, if we're hungry, we eat more. And if we eat more of these foods, they've got a lot of calories and a lot of superfluous requirements. Guess what? We get heavier. Guess what's happened over the last 40 years worldwide? We've all gotten heavier. But come back to RFKJ. Nobody, apart from him, and I'll put my hand up now, I'm number two, maybe other people are doing it, and if you are, look, that's great, is asking the question, what are we doing wrong? And it potentially can get even worse when we look at the push, which is sort of faltering now for fake meat, which is probably at the top of the list of ultra-processed food, because you're turning something which is not meat into something that's pretend meat. If you don't want to eat meat, don't eat it. Now, I'm not a fan of that, but I don't have to be, and it doesn't matter. But if you don't want to eat it, don't. Eat vegetables. If you want to be a vegan, eat as a vegan does. But eat properly in terms of the sort of foods that suits that diet, rather than let's manufacture something and process it to sort of, I'm trying to say process it to death, it's probably not the best term, but process it so that it is so far removed from what it started out as to be totally unrecognisable. That has a cost, and it's a hidden cost, but that cost is ultimately paid by the body in years to come. Now, obviously, there's a lot of money in processed foods. There's not as much money in the sale of fresh fruits and vegetables, or dairy products, or meat, fish, or chicken. So maybe that's the reason why nobody's asking the question, because nobody really wants to know the answer. And when I say nobody, I'd probably mean big businesses, not small businesses, not small markets, not small producers, but big businesses. Big government doesn't want to know either. And sadly, big public health doesn't seem to have any particular interest in this either. Because ultimately, it's a money train for everybody. There's a classic example, I don't want to give any names, but there's a company that produces a whole lot of confectionery and also produces weight loss products. So you click the ticket coming in and coming out. It's a good business model. It's a good business model for the medical profession and for the pharmaceutical industry as well. And certainly, money works its way into government coffers. So the only people who miss out are the public. So the greatest act of revolution is just to defy all these people and ignore the dietary advice from big public health. Get rid of the processed foods. Have a little bit if you want to. We live in the modern era. I'm not saying you can't have anything in your pantry that comes in a box. It's okay, but minimise it. And certainly completely get away from the fake meats. Eat mainly foods that if you don't eat them in the next week or two, they either have to be frozen or thrown out. Drink mainly water. Eat essentially as our ancestors did up until about the 60s and 70s. It's not complicated. It's not expensive. As I've said in previous podcasts, you don't need degrees in dietetics for this. You don't need government involvement. In fact, we want to get government out. And you can take control of your own health and improve your health. Thanks for listening to Dr. Joe Unplugged. If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe, like, and share. You can also follow it on all the socials. There'll be new content uploaded each week.